1995. These authors refer repeatedly to individual agents, individual consumers, the consumer, the decision maker, and to she or to her. They say, welfare analysis concerns itself with the evaluation of the effects of changes in the consumer's environment on her well-being. End of quote. Nowhere in that quotation, or anywhere else in the book, as far as I know, is there in general any suggestion that the individual, the consumer, is to be understood other than literally. And yet, at one point, they blithely ask the reader to consider a household formed by mom, dad, and child that makes decisions by majority voting, and as a result turns out to have intransitive household preferences. Throughout the rest of the book, which it just ignore. These authors, Mascollet and his co-authors, are quite properly very careful and very precise about commodities which are only available in integer amounts and are not divisible, about continuity and differentiability of functions, about the existence of a utility index and lexicographic orderings and so on. And yet, they are completely casual with respect to the foundational concept of the consumer. What has emerged then from these examples spanning the period 1915 to 1995? First, economists writing on consumer theory most certainly do not, collectively, meet Coase's requirement that foundational concepts should be absolutely clear, or at least as clear as possible. Secondly, this is not just a matter of different authors proceeding differently, for, as we have seen, only too often a given author or group of authors are internally inconsistent. They contradict themselves on this question. Thirdly, there is a tendency for authors to be more ready to speak of households and families when it is welfare economics that is under consideration. Towards the end of the lecture, I shall discuss these issues in greater detail. But before I do that, I turn briefly to consider an important alternative to the standard Paretian welfare economics, the classical liberal approach, which has its own latent difficulties, re individuals and households. Classical liberal theory. I can only be very brief here, so I focus on a single work, Milton and Rose Friedman's Free to Choose of 1980. And I consider only a very restricted aspect even of this work. The Friedmans note that early on in On Liberty, John Stuart Mill's famous work of 1859, Mill wrote, and this is a very famous passage, "The sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number, is self-protection." The Friedmans quote also from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations the claim that one duty of the sovereign is that of protecting, as far as possible, every member of society from the injustice or oppression of every other member of it. Now, Mill's famous assertion is, of course, highly relevant to the classical liberal argument for the virtues of a free market. But it does not hold good with respect to children. Parents and guardians may very well be warranted in interfering with the liberty of action of children for whom they are responsible, and for reasons other than the self-protection of the parent or the guardian. At the same time, children may sometimes need the Smithian protection of the sovereign from oppression by their parents or guardians, unfortunately. As the Friedmans themselves put it, we do not believe in freedom for madmen or children. We must somehow draw a line between responsible individuals and others. We cannot categorically reject paternalism. This is Milton Friedman, remember? We cannot categorically reject paternalism for those whom we consider as not responsible. The family, rather than the individual, has always been and remains the basic building block of society. Nevertheless, the Friedmans do not adopt a Roman law view of the pater familias. They say, we do not believe in the right of parents to do whatever they will with their children. Children have ultimate rights of their own. Thus, issues revolving around individuals, households, families and children give rise to foundational problems in classical liberal theory, as well as in mainstream theory. In both kinds of thinking, we have to recognise the consequence of the fact that, as the Friedmans write, one child has parents deeply concerned about his welfare, another has dissolute, improvident parents. Recognising that I have, of course, barely scratched the surface of classical liberal theory here, I must now rush on to consider some implications for mainstream theory of thinking seriously about the question, is the consuming agent an individual or a household? So I distinguish clearly, sharply, between explanatory theory and welfare economics, and I begin with explanatory theory. We do a thought experiment. It's a rather wild, crazy thought experiment. The point is you have to take it literally. Consider the possibility that the consumer is taken to be strictly an individual, really strictly. We then obtain the prediction that all babies will die because these individual consumers have no income. And even if they had an income, they wouldn't be able to use it. They'd die. Eventually there will be no one alive. So this prediction is regularly falsified, and the interpretation must be rejected. Any worthwhile explanatory theory must take the consumer to be a household. It's not an arbitrary choice, or I'll do this or I'll do that. You have to take the consumer to be a household. Because if you try to take it to be literally an individual, you get a nonsense prediction. The otherwise inevitable death of all babies could be averted, of course, if compassionate individuals took them into their care for some years, but then they would be forming multi-individual households, and we'd be back to households, whether or not with natural parents and natural children. So, it's households. The idea that the consumer can always be literally an individual is nonsense. It has to be households. Which is why even the theorists who talk about individual every so often say, oh, really I mean a household, really I mean a family. For the moment, let us put aside such questions as, how does a household consisting of 2 adults and 3 awkward teenage children come to be representable by a single, consistent, transitive preference ordering? I'll put that question aside not because it's unimportant, but because we can't discuss everything at once. We may consider, say, a household containing only a widow and a young child, a child who is too young to play any active role in economic decision-taking. So for purposes of the economic theorists doing consumer theory, this is a very simple kind of household, a widow and a very young child. How might the widow's preferences and purchases be represented? Well, of course, there's no one correct answer to that. I'll just suggest some possibilities. A. The widow might decide that the child will always have a fixed bundle of goods, C1, C2, up to Cn. And that then, having made sure that the child has that bundle, she maximises her own utility function subject to the household budget constraint. So she maximises her personal utility subject to two constraints, the household budget constraint and the child gets the fixed bundle. If her utility function is of the Cobb-Douglas form, then the result is no different from the so-called Stone-Geary analysis of household behaviour with its well-known properties. So we can just use the well-known materials. Perhaps a little more interesting, possibility B. The widow might decide not to give the child a fixed bundle, but to keep the child on a given indifference level, as interpreted by her, of course. She has to interpret what is meant by keeping the child on a given indifference level for the child. And then she maximises her utility, subject to the household budget constraint, and the constraint of keeping the child on this fixed indifference level, rather than a fixed bundle. Consider now the effect of a caeteris paribus fall in the price of the first commodity. There will be a first substitution effect, which means that the child now